It's really crazy to think of. If things get knocked into the Stone Age, like if you go back to the sophistication of ancient Egypt and you think about what the civilization could have been like. I mean, you're just speculating. You're just trying to just imagine how they could have moved these 500-ton stone blocks 500 miles. You're putting all these things into your mind. And then say, how long does it take to get from that, if you knock back into barbarians, how long does it take to get from that to where we are now?
Well, evidence would suggest something like 6,000 years.
Which is wild.
It is.
You think about, if you think about how absolutely ruthless people were 2,000 years ago, doesn't it kind of make sense that those are the ones that made it through, and then it took a long time before they calmed the down.
Right.
So if you go back to, whatever it was, the sophistication level that people were at when they built ancient Egypt, let's just speculate that it was 20,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And you think about how much they had to endure to get to that point, and how much they had to. I mean, there's real evidence, and if you especially pay attention to the work of people like Steven Pinker, that over time there's been less violence, less crime, less everything. Like civilization has gotten better. We are calming down from now versus the way we were 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago. Things are moving in the correct direction. But how long does it take before you have this level of sophistication that allows you to get to the pyramids? And then we're nowhere near that now. So even on the most conservative speculation that the Great Pyramid is only 4,500 years ago, we're not even anywhere near that now. We're nowhere near the level of sophistication that it took them to build, and we're just guessing as to what kind of technology they had available to them. And as you pointed out, with these vases and with just the alignment to the constellations, the sophistication that's involved in the construction to get stones that are tons of stone that you can't even get a razor blade in between. Like, what the fuck was going on?
Here's the fun thing to entertain us about moving the stone. So all that black granite that came from
500 miles away.
Yeah.
Crazy like that, yeah. There's stones that were cut from a quarry that was 500 miles away. I have no idea how they did that. No idea how they moved them. No idea how they got them through the mountains. They cut obelisks that were like thousands of tons. They moved them through the mountains and got them hundreds of miles away. They have no idea how they did that. They were probably very sophisticated, but in a different way than us.
Egypt, Nile River, you could basically define it into three areas. Up to the north, which is Lower Egypt, because it's lower on the river, limestone, sandstone, and then we have an area of granite, and that's where the Aswan quarry is, Thebes. So down here in Aswan, important feature to note, which just sort of seems to be missed all the time, is since they built the dam, the annual flooding used to stop. The annual flooding would allow you to bring stones right up to the base of the pyramid. For instance, colossi of Memnon, you could, like, once you got them, these actually come down, these are quartzite from down near Cairo, Giza, but that quarry is right next to the river. When the flooding happened, it's even a shorter distance from the quarry to the river. So for instance, these could have been floated in. And then we have Aswan with the unfinished quarry. The dam now, again, has changed to old rhythm of life that used to define that area for so long. Aerial view of Aswan and the quarry in the blue section is where the unfinished obelisk is, as well as other pits from earlier obelisks. There are inscriptions there writing about when those obelisks were moved. It will be said the obelisks come of a later period, same as the colossal statues. Now, Rogan and his friends there, just everything's pre-dynastic, 20,000. It's 20,000 years old. Just completely ignoring all the evidence that is there, because everything, if you can just shift it back, then you can do a Graham Hancock and say Atlantis, the comet impact ate my homework. So there it is. We see the pits even, when they fill up with water. So as we'll see, there are canal extensions. Joe Rogan really needs to get people who actually do the work rather than stone pointers who just, point at a stone, Atlantis, look at Cataclysm, make my homework. Elevation, but the river itself is already 85 metres, so it's very short. It's downhill, another thing, and right next to the river, just by taking those elevations. Now, the flood covered more of an area. I'm only showing the area that's important, relevant to the known area of quarrying, where the known obelisks were removed. The locals know about the flooding because their grandparents, great-grandparents still remember when that used to happen. Canal extensions, work has been done. Rogan and his, archaeologists don't know what they're talking about. These guys don't know what they're talking about. They've been just repeating it for years. I get these comments, how did they move them up and down mountains? It didn't happen, Joe. It didn't happen. Other people, you say this nonsense and other people need to clean up your mess. All right, so flooding would even bring the canal, the harbour, right next to the quarry. And then we have, again, how did they transport? Well, the stone was moved 500 miles, but that was done by river. It was actually moved, even to get it to the site, less than a mile on land, and then 500 miles by the river. So there are lots of descriptions of when the obelisks were made and when they were moved. And then we have the river, which does all the rest. Ancient equipment, but so 500 miles is just it's a trope that just keeps getting repeated. Joe and his guests are always, mocking the archaeologists. You're spreading BS, buddy. You're spreading BS, and you're doing it to a huge audience. You are the CNN of ancient history.
They probably had technology that we haven't figured out yet because we went to combustion engines and electricity, and that's how we figured out how to use the human creativity and constantly innovating when we created technology that went in this way. But it's really possible that another culture 20,000 years ago or whatever had figured out a way to innovate the way we have with combustion engines and electronics, but in a completely different way.
It is very hard for archaeologists to explain how that was done using purely leverage and mechanical advantage. You can say, perhaps they built a ramp and hauled the stones up the ramp. But then you have to confront basic laws of physics. You can't haul a stone weighing tens of tons up a slope that exceeds 10 degrees. Then you start doing the calculation. How long a ramp do I need with a 10-degree slope to get to 350 feet above the ground? Just dismiss all of that because science says it's impossible.
Yes, science!
Okay.
A few moments later.
Maybe they cultivated powers of the human mind that we dismiss.
Both of those sound equally preposterous.
And regard as completely unimportant. Woo-woo.
Fuck you, science!
When you have an idea and it's in your head, it's very difficult for people to shake that idea, and they start arguing that idea becomes a part of their identity.
But we hear anecdotal reports.
We've got all this, evidence
of people who have telekinetic powers, who can move things with their minds, of people who have telepathic powers. And our automatic reaction is to just dismiss all of that because science says it's impossible. But then you have to confront basic laws of physics, who can move things with their minds. Basic laws of physics, basic laws of physics, basic laws of physics.
So people who don't have any education, and then they watch one of these YouTube clips, they start actually believing that this stuff makes sense because it's unchecked.
And our automatic reaction is to just dismiss all of that because science says it's impossible.
If you base the design of rockets on science, they reach the moon. It works, bitches.
Well, hang on. Maybe there would have been maybe they did. Maybe the idea that they regard as absurd, maybe that idea are anecdotal reports of maybe we could wake those techniques up.
Well, it's pure speculation. I don't know what they would use. I don't know how they did it. But if you imagine human beings going from the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago to what we enjoy today. That's a tiny blip in time when you're talking about 20,000, 30,000 years. If these people figured out some form of technology that we still haven't figured out yet, it's totally possible that that could be the case. And if that's the case, they got hit. They got boom, boom, comets slammed into the earth. A giant percentage of the population died. The people that survived clawed and scraped for generations, and they lived like barbarians, and they forgot everything. And then they rebuilt or moved into the pyramids or claimed it as their own.
But the ones that came from the eastern part of Egypt.
Oh, the Wadi Hammamet quarry that's in the east? Yeah, in the mountains?
In the mountains of...
it's nowhere near the Nile.
Right. And so they would have had...
the ground.
You'd have to go up and down mountains to move these things that were tens of tons. Like off cliffs, and because like the narrative is like, oh well, they would have.
Here we see the Wadi Hammamet quarry and its location, and they moved these over mountains and up and down hills. Well, Wadi Hammamet is on a dry riverbed, and it is an ancient trade route from the Red Sea all the way to the Nile. So again, this off cliffs and over mountains. Well, it's a rockfall quarry, which is right next to the road. So even quarrying the stone, they didn't really have to even pull it down the mountains, or and there was no hills. You just this ancient trade route. They didn't go over cliffs, and up and down mountains. They took the natural course of the riverbed, and from the Red Sea all the way to the Nile. The road, modern road, still follows this path. Not a cliff, not a mountain to go up and down on the whole way. The narrative is to create problems that don't exist. Say that obelisks and 100,000-ton objects were coming from here, but even the tens of tons, the unfinished unfinished sarcophagi that were from there, just aren't anywhere near the level that they're describing. And so again, you can I referenced the quarry and up and down hills and mount. Well, it's just not the case. It's just, again, totally made up. Create a problem that doesn't exist, so you can insert singing, levitating priests and anti-gravity, but mechanical advantage, or they couldn't possibly use that. It's just a nonsense. Anything to insert Atlantis.
I have no idea how they did that. No idea how they moved them. No idea how they got them through the mountains. They cut obelisks that were like thousands of tons. They moved them through the mountains and got them hundreds of miles away. They have no idea how they did that. They were probably very sophisticated, but in a different way than us.
It's like the narrative is like, oh, well, they would have brought these stones up the Nile.
Right.
Well, there's stones out there that are on the other side of the Nile in the mountains. So how did they bring those?
There's enormous stones.
Huge.
Enormous.
Well, there's 1,000-ton stones.
There's evidence. There's multiple statues that I can show you pictures of, that there were single-piece statues. So you have the unfinished obelisk in the quarry. That's 1,200 tons. But then you have at least 3 or 4 finished statues that were 1,000 tons, single-piece granite. And one of them's in a place called Tanis, which is way up in the north in the delta. That's more than 1,000 miles from where that stone came from. And then moving that thing, I mean, it was around 1,000 tons finished, single piece granite. So moving it, you may be at 1,500 tons or more.
When it comes to these colossal statues, and there are a collection at Tanis, there's also the Ozymandias statue, as it's called, in the Ramesseum. Absolutely massive. Yeah, about 1,000 tons. Why they would take a 15-ton block and then move it and then carve it, well, I don't know. I don't think they did. I think this is, we see examples where they worked them in the quarries to remove as much weight as possible. But here's the point. You'll see Rogan, Graham Hancock, and right inside Uncharted, they're always put 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago. Their aim is to get everything and say it's dynastic. They literally say it like the Egyptians just inherited it. They just walked in there and then, just matched their style to the style of clothing and to the style of writing, and they just took that all up. But He says again, 1,000 miles away, where it's to 500 miles. It's by the river. So originally near Avaris was the older capital. That branch, and this map is showing the old branches of a river, that dried up, and then they moved those to Tanis. That was around the 13th century BC. So again, everything is just pre-dynastic. It's this magic just cure, or like, that's pre-dynastic. Oh, I don't like that. No, that's dynastic, but that's pre-dynastic. This isn't mentioned. It's just, they wave it away with a hand. So again, there's so much known, the records, so much work has been done, but these guys just, they don't know, they're just stupid. No one knows this. It's a load of bunkum.
That there's a quarry in Egypt, I think it's called the Minya quarry, which has these blocks. They're still attached, where they've cut these big blocks out, and there's like an image of what looks like a giant pharaoh that's been carved on top of it. They're made from limestone. Now, maybe they were never intended to be blocks, or maybe they were never intended to be finished, but if you assume they're blocks, these two blocks weigh, I think it's 3,500 and 5,000 tons a piece, based on the density of limestone in that region. Like, they're not disconnected, but that's the scale. We know there's objects up to like 1,200 tons, but the fact that they moved them 1,000 miles, and we have examples. There's a stone called the Russian Thunderstone. Have you heard of this?
No.
So, like in the 1700s, they took a big lump of, I think it's granite or something like that, from Finland, and they shipped it to St. Petersburg, and they carved it into a statue. It's still there today. It's the Thunderstone. It's an edifice. It weighed. That's it now. Yeah, that's the finished one. This image here is the right one, yeah. So this is how they did it in the 1700s, the Thunderstone. And they moved it around 150 meters a day. It took them forever. And the only way they did this was by basically sinking giant, like, logs into the ground to give them a leverage point for these capstans. And they'd move a system of rails, big steel rails with steel ball bearings behind it. It weighed about 1,500 tons. And just over a period of just very slow grinding and turning with capstans and pulleys and these steel tracks, they move at about 150 meters a day. It took them forever. And in order to get that thing across the water from Finland, they had to construct a giant barge, like a huge barge. And on each side of the barge, they would tie up 3 warships just to try and keep it stable. And it's about the same size.
This is the Thunderstone in St. Petersburg. Now we have the bronze on top, the horse, but the stone itself, and a portion of that is buried underneath. So as it weighs now, it should be about 600 tons. It's much heavier originally, 2,000 tons approximately, where they found it in a frozen bog in Finland. It was a large piece of stone, and it was dug up. Now, one of the problems was that the ground was boggy. They had to wait until the ground froze before they could move the Thunderstone. So there's and again, white ground, because it was snowing, they had to wait for it to move. So often you'll say, it took them this long. Well, that was because you could only move it at certain times. Now, also the crew was very small. It wasn't throwing a huge crew at the Thunderstone. They were using capstones and compound pulleys, and they were also using these rails with bronze spheres, using them as bearings. This was not necessary, and I'll show examples, because there are giant stones even filmed. Wood is very strong, and you can slide them across them on the rail. But this was an innovation, frictionless bearing. So this was not necessary. It was more of a modern innovation. But again, there are examples where we can look at where it's not necessary to. Now, even though the frame consisted of a lot of wood, so often you'll hear, well, wood would be crushed underneath the weight. This is a claim you'll hear Ben say later, and it just gets repeated all the time. It's just an absolute nonsense. When they do big, look at the old ships being built, what do they have underneath? Wood. You'll see examples. But here are some of the old illustrations. Now, all of this info seems to come from Wikipedia, and they didn't even bother to click through to the links. But they brought it in. Well, the important part, like we see the cross section of the rails and the bearings, the bronze spheres. Just highlighted that section, and you can see in there's the bronze spheres. Now, only moved 150 meters, and it took forever to move this thing. Well, this thing was moved across land further than any of the giant obelisks or statues, for one thing. it was moved across boggy land, so I had to wait, which added to the time. So moved further across much more difficult terrain, and so that's now. And also, and they're moving into place again, because they had these rails, they only had a limited amount, so you have to dismantle them, bring the next section forward, bolt that together, then move it forward again. That was one of the reasons why because the rails were expensive to make. The crew was very small. Again, they're only using 2 capstans. But then there's a claim, but they had to build a giant... Well, it's a giant bit of stone, so they had to build a giant barge, but the barge itself is, again, not huge in comparison to, the basic rules of displacement tells you what you need. This was well understood, even back to Archimedes, this was understood. And then, they needed 3 warships on either side to balance it out. No, they just had one on either side, and that was to propel the barge forward as much as anything. People back then could build stable barges. They knew how to lay things in the centre. So again, we create this... Well, they used rails and bearings. They didn't need to use them. Yes, they used them, but this was not necessary. And it took forever and forever. Well, they moved it further overland than any of these statues or obelisks were moved. So at that 150 metre per day rate, well, how far were the obelisks and the statues moved? A kilometre at most. So, okay, it took them a week. Now, but forever. So, okay, it took a week. Big BFD, big friggin' deal. And then again create this the giant barge, and I need a free, but no, it's just not now. So again, this is again how do they get anything correct? The amount of air, like up and down mountain, all the stuff that they make up it's like, do they go out of their way to get so many things wrong? It'd be easier to make a list of the things they get right in these type of talks than the things that they get wrong.
Just to try and keep it stable. It's about the same size, same mass as the obelisk that's sitting in this mountainous quarry in Egypt, in Aswan. It's still in the ground. It's like 1,200 tons of granite. And you're expected to believe that they somehow are going to lift this thing up out of a quarry over these, like, basically big hills and mountains of granite, and put it on a little ship that's narrowed in this, they call it the harbour there, and it's this tiny little space. I'm like, you're absolutely delusional.
Speaking of absolute delusion, let's and remind you that these people lead tours and present themselves as knowledgeable, experts on this topic. Here we have an aerial view and unfinished obelisk just here, and as a reference point we have the Movenpick Resort. We see the same island, the Movenpick Resort, and there in the background we have the mountainous quarry, the mountainous quarry which is on the side of the river. And this is how they would go 1,000 tons up, and it's up in the mountains, and we've got to go over cliffs that don't exist. Mountains that are, they are technically mountains, but they have a nice, gentle riverbed trade route going right through them. And then how did they going to lift this out of the hill? Well, the hill that he's talking about is here, so that's the area towards the river which leads towards that harbour, and the canal system, which again extensively researched. These evil academics do all this work, and Joe Rogan and these guys just poo all over them. But this is the hill, and you can see that they've already started removing it. So how were they going to lift it out? Could they have lifted it out? Well, yeah, but why would you? Because they've already, that's the hill that they started to remove. So the mountainous quarry and the hills and mountains of this giant quarry is, as about as, it's just right. It's completely made up. They create a problem which doesn't exist, exaggerate the hell out of it, and then just dismiss mechanical advantage. We've got to bring in sonic levitation or some other rubbish as well. This is just silly. Now, I wouldn't even say it's delusion. You can see the pattern in which they work. Create a problem that doesn't exist, therefore we need a new answer. Downplay the abilities of ancients. Wood will be crushed under rollers and all this other nonsense. So it can't be done, therefore it must be pre-dynastic 20,000 years ago. Now we can invent any fantasy that we want, and it seems reasonable, it seems equivalent, and this is why, lost ancient technology is a scam. Millions of people have fallen for it. People like Joe Rogan just have, where are the counterpoints that they bring up? He pushes this heavily, then you see him repeat it, and then everyone else has to deal with the nonsense which comes out of this grift industry.
Do you think this was a simple task that could be achieved with primitive methods and then ship that thing 1,000 miles somewhere? It's
When you speculate, when you sit around by yourself, because you've thought about this a lot, how the fuck do you think they did this?
Look,
Just take a wild
ass guess. I think there's connections possibly to gravity manipulation. I think anti-gravity had to play a part in moving some of this stuff. I actually think there's some connections to some of the work that's being done with this plasmoid implosion technology, the stuff that Randall's been looking into, that's coming back to talk a little bit about. The relationship and the sacred geometry aspects of that are similar to the things that we see in some of these cultures in the past. So that may potentially have something to do with the methods that were used in the past. But I'm convinced it was a form of advanced technology. Now, whether it's our form of technology, because let's face it, we can do things like that today, but it takes hydraulics and diesel powers and cranes and all that stuff. They may have had an entirely different avenue of tech, and that you open up into the realm of resonance and acoustics and anti-gravity. I think resonance in particular might have played a strong role, because that's certainly a feature that you see in some of these older structures, whether it's an accident or not, but some of them are incredibly resonant. The Great Pyramid generates a tone just on its own that comes from the earth in there.
It generates a tone.
It does. It generates a low tone. It's basically
you
coming
can hear
from
it,
the earth.
or is it?
If you're quiet enough, you can, but it's certainly been picked up in a whole number of different experiments where they're measuring the tone. It does. The whole structure does generate a low tone. It's an interesting thing. A lot of these places that typically have a connection to underground water as well. Like,
they're immense, and some of them were cut from a quarry that's hundreds of miles away. How do you think they did that?
Well, some of them, the granite in the Great Pyramid comes from more than 500 miles to the south. If you look at the famous King's Chamber, its walls and its roof are the ceiling of the King's Chamber are all made with gigantic granite blocks.
Stunning detail.
Stunning detail. Those blocks on the roof of the King's Chamber weigh 70 tons each. Now, Egyptologists will tell you that, they could move heavy blocks because they put them on wet sand and they push them along on wet sand. Well, maybe if you're just at ground level, that will do. But when you're 350 feet above the ground, as you are in the King's Chamber, that won't do at all.
This 350 feet above the ground is a talking point which I see in comments. I get in comments as well. I've got to tell you, it is just silly. It doesn't make any sense. Now, Silbury Hill, but you can pick any hill. So let's imagine this is a 350 feet hill. At ground level, the physics, it's fine, but at 350 feet above the ground, that won't do at all. Well, is there different rules at 300 feet elevation? Do the rules of physics change? And is that relative to sea level or to what? It is just silliness. The only way that makes any sense, 350 feet, is that the pyramid was built from the top down, levitating, and they had to support it underneath. It's a stupid point. It doesn't make any sense, and it's a talking point that people like Graham Hancock use with us. 350 feet. It's just stupid. Now, we don't know exactly how it was done. Another point that Graham Hancock makes: ramps have to be. You can't go above 10 degrees. Physics tells us. No, it doesn't. Dr. Mustafa, parapsychic TV presenter, former medical doctor. He was the one who introduced this. There is no basis to it. It is just stairs are ramps. Staircases exist. They go more than 10 degrees. Depending on the surface, you might slip. So you have steps in there. There are quarries in Egypt where they have 26-degree ramps and 26-degree ramps. Just happen to be that angle there that's in the pyramid as well. 27 degrees is not a magical angle either. You have steps, you can get grip, you can work. This 10-degree ramp thing is just stupid. Now, we have here are the 70-ton blocks that he's talking about there in the King's Chamber. Well, one possibility, again, I don't know how the exact, but during construction, well, you got one ramp, sort of built in, and then we have that new void that was found, but also as you're building, you have that ramp system going up, and and you get to the top. Now, it wasn't built top down. This 350 feet in the air is just stupid. It is. They know, but just like with the 10-degree ramps and these other talking points, like wood would crush under the weight, they know it's not true because it's not feasible, and they love it. It's not feasible. It's not feasible that people who have been at this for decades and talk about physics and mechanicals and all that, they do not know this. So again, they talk a great game, but they are full of bunkum, and they should have resolved this years ago. But it's been highlighted to them, but they just keep repeating it. It is just, at this point, it's not even stupid. It's a lie at this point.
Won't do it all. I don't know how they did it. All I know is they did it. I don't think anybody knows how they did it, how they lifted those stones, how they brought them up to that level. I think we're looking, again, at a lost technology. And it was this ancient apocalypse 12,800 years ago that wiped that from the human memory banks almost completely.
I don't know what they would use. I don't know how they did it. But if you imagine human beings going from the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago to what we enjoy today, that's a tiny blip in time when you're talking about 20,000, 30,000 years. If these people figured out some form of technology that we still haven't figured out yet, it's totally possible that that could be the case. And if that's the case, they got hit. They got boom, boom, comets slammed into the earth. A giant percentage of the population died. The people that survived clawed and scraped for generations, and they lived like barbarians, and they forgot everything. And then they rebuilt or moved into the pyramids or
to
claimed
your
it
point,
as their own.
I don't know how they did it. All I know is they did it. I don't think anybody knows how they did it, how they lifted those stones, how they brought them up to that level. I think we're looking, again, at a lost technology. And it was this ancient apocalypse 12,800 years ago that wiped that from the human memory banks almost completely, not entirely completely because there were survivors, but removed. And I think the key thing is we're looking at technologies that are not the same as ours.
Yes.
And that's partly why archaeologists can't see them, because they're looking for us in the past, and they're not open to the possibility that there are whole other kinds of technology that could be used.
Right.
I always go back to the ancient Egyptian traditions that speak of priests chanting as these huge blocks were lifted into the air. Were they using some kind of sound effect, some kind of use of sound that was able to manipulate matter? We know that sound can manipulate matter, as a matter of fact, but they're lifting these blocks. Again and again, it appears in ancient Egyptian traditions. The notion that we could lift huge blocks with sound seems absurd to archaeologists, and yet it's there in the traditions of the Egyptologists. And what Randall's talking about now is people who are working on a whole alternative path of technology, and maybe that's a rediscovery of the kind of technologies that were used by a lost civilization.
I think that's what's important about what you're saying, is that we have this very limited idea of technology based on what we've experienced.
Yeah.
But if you had anatomically similar human beings that lived for thousands and thousands of years.
Stuff just keeps on getting older.
If you think about the amount of progress that we've achieved as modern humans just in the last few hundred years, if you go back 400 years to now, it's a stunning amount of achievement.
Absolutely stunning.
And if you have a completely different path of technology, one that's not utilizing internal combustion engines and cranes and the like that we experience
leverage,
today.
Mechanical advantage, everything that our tech is based around.
Something that's insanely advanced, tens of thousands of years of a different path.
Yeah.
And that may be what we're looking at.
And that may
emerging around 6,000 years ago, which they used to think. These guys are saying it's probably way earlier than that.
Oh, it's just
probably
a cycle.
20,000 years. Yeah,
reboots.
and that explains the pyramids. That explains these incredibly complex geometric structures they built in Africa. Who knows how many thousand years ago? How the fuck did they do it? No one knows. No one has any good ideas. All the ideas suck. All of them are like ridiculous.
This is a Lateran obelisk in Rome, moved from Egypt. There's another one almost identical size. Originally they were like 400 tons. The heaviest one fell in an earthquake. The bottom broke off, and so now it's about 350 tons. But this, so Romans moved them even like 400 tons. It's just one of the supergiant obelisks. in the reign of Pope Sixtus V, it's either late 1500s or 1600s, I forget the exact date, pretty sure it's 1600s. They wanted to firstly re-erect one, and they wanted to move one into another location. This hadn't been done in such a long time, anything like this, so they went back and there was Roman records still found. They recreated the Roman machine to move and lift these, and here's an illustration of what had happened. Now, because it hadn't been done in such a long time, was so expensive and delicate operation, they set up a gallows, and the people who were watching, they said, look, anyone who talks or disturbs the workers, you're going to get hung. But as they started doing the job, the rope started to creak. There was even some rope smoking, and there was an old sailor. All cranes, all lifting equipment is, even the term lifting and rigging, as in rigging of sails. The forces on a sail are huge, and so to rig a ship, to lift up the mast, especially if it's knocked over in a storm, you can't just do it with manpower. There's only so many crew on a ship. You look at the old sailing ships, there's a limited crew, but they had to contend with tens and tens of tons of force with those ropes. That's why I use capstans and compound pulley systems. Romans such as Vitruvius talks about pulleys. He says these tools and capstans were so old, ancient to the Romans, that their origins had been lost in time. So you'll hear in a moment, but the Romans invented pulleys. But no. Pulleys aren't attributed to the Egyptians because we haven't found them. The oldest surviving Roman pulley is about 200 AD, but luckily we have drawings and descriptions of them. But the Egyptians were sailing from the pictures of their rigging. We know that they understood mechanical advantage. Because you just can't, unless Egyptian sailing ships were employing magic, they were using mechanical advantage. When you think of a pulley, you think of the axle and the wheel in there. That's just a low friction pulley. Throw a rope over a tree branch, you've changed the direction. You're pulling it and you've changed the direction. That is a pulley. That's all that a pulley does. And sailing ships is cranes. It's just that's just where it comes from. But this machine, lifting tower, as it was creaking and the ropes were going under stress, there was everyone had been threatened to be quiet. There was an old sailor there. He understood rigging. He understood mechanical advantage. He yelled out, "Wet the rope, save the operation." Now, you'll hear, but the sleds would be crushed under the weight. We'll hear that in a moment. That's just absolute nonsense. It's absurd. Giant ships, what do they build the rails on? Well, they have wood underneath. You see giant moving operations, dunnage they call it. So you'll see those big heavy ships that put the oil rigs and move the oil rigs on top. What do they use more often than not? Old railway sleepers. They line the deck with wood, super giant weights. Wood will support the weight. If anyone tells you otherwise, it's just absurd. It's a stupid, lost ancient high technology grift myth. And it needs to die. But using levers to fine tune, place the obelisk, capstans. What's a capstan? It's just like a gearbox. It's a spinning lever. The longer the lever, the more force you apply. This was based on older tech. Where did the Romans get their stuff from? Where the best Roman and Greek engineers usually emerged from? Alexandria in Egypt. Egyptians had sailing ships. Following cultures had sailing ships. The Roman and Greek ships weren't advanced shipping. They were just exactly the same as the old ones. So, all right, now, look, what can I tell you? This technology works. It doesn't require diesel engines. Like, again, Joe Rogan and, we can dismiss mechanical advantage and it just wouldn't work. And no, it does friggin' work. You just don't understand it. And you're so possessed by this apocalyptic cult, the cult of the apocalypse. The comets and went boom and the boom and it just wiped everything out and we lived like barbarians. And how long did it take to come back? Well, we never lost anything. The wealth is what drives these big monuments, but the sailing ship and the basic tech always existed there. It was just a matter of applying it and using the wealth from there. So if you ever hear, and we're going to hear more, the boats can't support the weight and they didn't, it is nonsense. It's completely untrue. these lost high-tech guys, on all these big podcasts that just pushed all that, they just keep saying the same thing over and over again. And if you want to have your, I believe in freedom of religion. If you want to have your apocalyptic cult, as long as you're not, doing full, going Jonestown on it, okay, that's great. That's up to you. But if you're going to be preaching to children, taking their birthright and saying this can't be lifted, this can't be cut, then I draw the line. Mr. Rogan, Mr. Hancock, you are, apart from your, cute little cult thing that you've got going on there, great, good for you, you do whatever you want to do. But if you're going to promote this idea that it can't be done and the physics won't work, no, that's a sin, and you're telling it to kids and you're stealing their birthright. Shame on you. You need to stop it. It is a very, very bad thing that you're doing.
We know there's water beneath the Giza Plateau. Places like the Coricancha in Peru, which is also a giant megalithic building. There's an underwater river near there. We always see some form of flowing water associated with it. Whether or not that has something to do with it, I don't know. But it's just in that realm of, I think it's the answers lay in realms of science that are outside of our current understanding, that we should be approaching with an open mind, because we might ultimately learn something from it if we do. Instead of just dismissing it, putting it in a box and said, you know what, we're superior to every civilization that's lived before.
Right.
They're primitive. They did it with primitive methods.
Right.
Done.
Right.
All things are a frequency. All things operate on resonance. And by the way, a quick little bizarre similarity when you're mentioning anti-gravity, that Dr. Chan Thomas, who wrote the Adam and Eve story, he was researching anti-gravity for McDonnell Douglas back in the 60s.
Listen, so, Jamie, put that back up, please. A recent study published on Ancient Origins website claims that the ancient Egyptians benefited from the use of sound waves between ancient cultures elsewhere in the world. Wow.
Yeah, all the boxes too. The Serapeum is an incredible site that houses like 25 of the biggest stone boxes you'll ever see. It's this one spot, and they're the biggest ones. They're like, some of them are up to like 70 tons with their lids 30 tons. And I've been there with some people that have been measuring like the frequency resonance range inside there. So at what range are you generating standing waves? And they all seem to have a very similar resonance tone to them. So it's an interesting experiment. Like you can stand inside a water tank or a concrete room and find a resonance, but it's interesting to go and actually analyze those aspects of these ancient structures and to speculate, maybe has this got anything to do with what they were made for? Because these are giant precision-made boxes made from syenite and granite that are perfectly flat and square, and they're just massively solid. They went to tremendous effort to remove imperfections from the stone, no cracks, almost like they didn't want the damn things to shake apart or vibrate.
Well, it's just the sheer scale of them. Like it flies in the face of logic. Like the actual archaeologists that want to lock this down and try to come up with some sort of a conventional reason and, some sort of an explanation that we can all get behind. Oh, they used pulleys and pushed them on logs. Like, shut the fuck up. Yeah. Just shut the fuck up. What you're saying doesn't even make any goddamn sense. It's way more likely that there was incredibly sophisticated technology that existed, and it's way more likely, in face of the evidence of the Younger Dryas impact theory, that shit was wiped out. And that we're talking about a really advanced civilization that lived a long time ago, that's more advanced than we are today, but moved in a different direction. Like we moved in the direction of combustion engines and electronics, and they moved in some other direction, but achieved maybe many thousands of years more sophistication in that direction than we have with our internal combustion engines and electricity and all the shit that we use.
And it's